Welcome to Attic Static. Tonight we have 17 stories for you, including the inventory of apologies, the guest at table 4, the curator of the commute, and more. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the rain carry you. The inventory of apologies. Log entry 001. Command, turn on the showroom lights. The overhead fluorescents hummed to life, illuminating the rows of staged bedrooms. The furniture was perfect, each bed made with crisp linens, each nightstand holding a ceramic vase. It was a sanctuary of stillness, a gallery of domestic dreams waiting for inhabitants. Log entry 005. Command, dim the lights to 40%. The warmth of the bulb softened, casting long, velvet shadows across the duvet of the master suite. The air smelled of fresh sawdust and new fabric. Log entry 012. Command, turn off all lights. Silence fell, heavy and thick as wool. I stood in the center of the showroom, my own breath the only rhythmic pulse in the void. Log entry 015. Command, who is there? The voice was mine, but the echo felt like it belonged to a hollow chamber. Log entry 018. Command, please forgive me for the spill. A small, high-pitched voice answered from the corner of the Victorian bedroom. It was a child's voice, though no child was standing there. Forgive me for what? I whispered back. Log entry 022. Command, forgive me for the milk. The child's voice replied, I haven't spilled it yet. I blinked. The showroom remained empty, yet the atmosphere felt crowded. Log entry 030. Command, move to the Queen's Nook. I walked toward the back of the room, my footsteps muffled by the plush carpets. Log entry 034. Command, is it coming? I felt a sudden shift in the air, a displacement of volume as if something large had just inhaled. I squeezed my eyes shut for a heartbeat. When they opened, a shape stood by the wardrobe. Log entry 036. Command, who are you? It was a deer-gaited creature, its body composed of textured, velvet-like fur the color of a bruised plum. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, it possessed a wide, horizontal slit for a mouth and two large, protruding horns that curved like a ram's. It moved with a strange, staccato grace, its legs ending in soft, padded hooves. Log entry 040. Command, forgive me for the broken glass. The child's voice spoke again, this time from the ceiling. It hasn't shattered yet. I felt a prickle of heat on my neck. Log entry 045. Command, why do you apologize before it happens? The creature was closer now. It only moved when I blinked. Every time my eyelids met, the plum-colored shape leaped forward, its velvet fur rustling like silk rubbing against silk. Log entry 050. Command, stay still. The creature hovered at the edge of my vision. It was tall, its neck elongated, swaying with a rhythmic, swaying motion. Log entry 055. Command, forgive me for the noise. I haven't made it yet, the child whispered. I realized the voice was coming from the creature itself. It was the child's voice, but the creature was the source. Log entry 102. Command, how many things will I forgive? The creature moved to my left. I closed my eyes. When I opened them, it was directly in front of my face. Its horizontal mouth was slightly parted, revealing rows of tiny, pearlescent teeth. Log entry 110. Command, forgive me for the ending. It is happening now, the voice said. The creature's plum fur began to ripple. I felt a sudden, sharp pressure on my chest. Log entry 115. Command, close my eyes. I squeezed them shut tight, trying to hold the image of the velvet creature in my mind. I felt the air grow cold, and the smell of damp moss filled the showroom. Log entry 120. Command, open. I opened my eyes. The showroom was gone. The furniture was gone. The plum-colored creature was gone. I was standing in a vast, white void, and the child's voice echoed one last time, no longer coming from a distance, but from inside my own head. Log entry 125. Command, forgive me for being here. The creature reached out with a velvet limb and touched my forehead. It wasn't a gesture of affection. It was a claim. I realized then that the child wasn't apologizing for the creature's actions, but for the fact that it had finally found a host to inhabit. The voice whispered one final time as the void began to shrink. "Forgive me for the silence." I looked down at my own hands and saw they were beginning to turn the color of bruised plum. The guest at table 4. The rain didn't just fall, it hammered against the tin roof of the diner like a frantic heartbeat. It was 2 a.m., the hour when the world feels heavy and the silence between sounds becomes almost tangible. I sat at table 4, the linoleum beneath my boots slick with a thin film of moisture. The diner was mostly empty, save for a waitress who moved with a mechanical, rhythmic grace and a single, lonesome family photo propped against a salt shaker in the center of my table. It was an old, sepia-tone portrait of 4 people, a mother, a father, a young boy, and a girl. But something was wrong with the girl. While the others stared forward with clear, bright expressions, the girl was turned completely away from the camera, her face hidden as if she were deliberately hiding from the viewer. I found myself staring at her back, wondering what she was looking at in that frozen moment of the past. Then, the first footfall happened. It came from the far corner of the kitchen, a heavy, thunderous thud that vibrated the silverware against my plate. It was the sound of a giant's heel hitting the floor, yet there was no one there but the waitress. She was still moving at her steady pace. A second later, I heard a faint, muffled tap, so soft it was barely a whisper, coming from the ceiling directly above my head. It was the opposite of what the rhythm suggested. The entity was beginning to move. I looked up, but the ceiling was bare. The sound came again, a booming crash from the door, followed by a featherlight tick from the counter. The rhythm was inverted. It was as if the entity was walking on clouds during the moments it should have been stomping, and stomping through mud during the moments it should have been gliding. I felt a prickle of electricity on my neck. The diner grew colder, the air thickening with the scent of wet wool and old copper. Then, the chair across from me scraped back. It wasn't the waitress. She was at the far end of the counter. A figure sat down. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Its head was a smooth, seamless orb of polished amber, glowing with an internal, dim warmth. It had no mouth, no nose, and its eyes were wide, luminous pools of honey gold. It didn't have limbs of equal length. Its arms were thick and muscular, while its legs were thin as reeds. It reached out a hand, not a spindly thing, but a broad, paddle-like palm, and touched the family photo. As it did, the girl in the photo shifted. She didn't just turn, she pivoted slightly, revealing a sliver of her profile. She was looking directly at the amber-headed figure. The figure then made a sound, not a voice, but a vibration that hummed in my teeth. It was the sound of a cello string being pulled tight. It stood up, and the footfalls began again. Boom. The floor groaned under its weight. Tick. The air seemed to ripple. It moved toward the door, but instead of walking toward it, it seemed to be falling forward, each heavy step a crash, each light step a ghost of a sound. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs. The figure paused just before the door. It turned its amber head toward me. For a moment, the humming stopped, and the silence was so absolute I could hear my own blood rushing through my ears. The figure didn't move, but the girl in the photo turned her head fully now, her face finally revealed. She wasn't smiling. She was screaming, her mouth a perfect O of silent agony, her eyes wide and fixed on the space just behind my left shoulder. The amber figure raised its paddle-like hand and pointed at the empty air behind me. Then, the heavy thud came from right behind my ear, followed by a sound so soft it was like a breath against my hair. I felt a weight press against my spine, a presence that wasn't there a second before. The entity didn't have a body of its own. It was a traveler, and I was simply the nearest landmark in its journey. I realized then that the girl in the photo wasn't looking at the figure. She was looking at the thing that was currently standing right behind me, the one that hadn't made a single sound yet. The Curator of the Commute. The bus depot at 4 a.m. is a cathedral of linoleum and loneliness. Most of the seats are empty, save for a few scattered commuters who look like statues carved from wax. I sat on a hard wooden bench, the air smelling of diesel exhaust and damp concrete. Across from me, a single missing person flyer was taped to a pillar. It showed a girl with a wide smile, but the edges were curling. The depot was mostly silent, except for the rhythmic hum of the ventilation system. It was then that I heard it, a sharp, singular knock from inside the metal grate of the ceiling vent. "You will sit down," the voice whispered from the metal ribs. It wasn't a human voice exactly. It sounded like two pieces of sandpaper rubbing together, wet and deliberate. I jumped, looking up at the grate. There was no one there, just a swirl of dust. "You will notice the flyer," the voice continued. I looked at the girl's face. A small piece of yellow tape sat at the bottom. "You will see the first note," it murmured. I leaned in. A tiny strip of paper had appeared, stuck to the bottom of the flyer. It read, "The girl is not lost. She is merely being collected." I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. The depot felt larger now, the shadows in the corners stretching like ink spilled on a tablecloth. The hum of the vents changed pitch, becoming a low, vibrating moan. "You will feel the temperature drop," the voice narrated. I gasped as the humid air suddenly turned crisp, as if a door had opened in a distant room. "You will hear the footsteps," it said. From the far end of the hall, a heavy, rhythmic thud began. It wasn't the sound of shoes on floor. It sounded like something heavy and soft being dragged across the tile. "You will see the shadow," the voice whispered. A shape began to stretch from the ceiling, elongated and lopsided. It didn't have a body, just a flickering silhouette that moved independently of any light source. I gripped the edge of my seat. The depot felt like it was shrinking. The silence between the voices' narrations became heavier, more pressurized. "You will notice the second note," it commanded. I squinted at the flyer. Another strip of paper had appeared. It read, "The collector is hungry for a witness." The dragging sound grew faster. It was coming toward me now. I could hear the friction of something textured moving against the floor, not skin, but something like polished bark or scales. "You will see the visitor," the voice announced with a sudden, dramatic flare. From behind the pillar, the entity emerged. It was not a ghost or a man. It was a creature made of layered, overlapping porcelain plates, each one etched with a different geometric pattern. It had no face in the traditional sense, but a large, central plate where a mouth should be, which opened and closed with a melodic click. It moved with a jerky, mechanical grace, its body composed of dozens of these white tiles. It didn't walk so much as it rearranged itself as it moved. "You will realize the visitor is the one who wrote the notes," the voice said. The creature stopped directly in front of me. It didn't have eyes, but I felt its gaze. It reached out with a limb made of 3 interlocking segments, each ending in a rounded, marble-like bulb. "You will feel the touch," it narrated. It extended a limb and pressed the marble bulb against my forehead. It was freezing, like a stone pulled from a winter pond. "You will see the final note," the voice whispered, now sounding almost breathless. A third piece of tape appeared on the flyer. I leaned forward, my heart hammering against my ribs. The note read, "The girl is you." I looked at the flyer again. The girl's face had changed. The wide smile was gone, replaced by my own expression of startled awe. I looked at the porcelain creature, which hummed a low, vibrating note. It reached out again, its marble bulb moving toward my chest. "You will become the next flyer," the voice said. The creature opened its central mouth, and a soft, white light spilled out, swallowing the depot. I felt my skin begin to harden into ceramic, my memories turning into etchings on my skin. The voice didn't narrate the next part because there was no one left to hear it. The guest of the tide gauge hut. Welcome, everyone, to the edge of the world. If you would all step closer, please mind the salt crust on the floorboards. We are standing at the terminus of the pier, at the very tip of the wooden spine that reaches into the bay. And there, perched like a lonely hat on a table, is the tide gauge hut. It is a small, weathered shack where the pulse of the ocean is measured by a rising metal rod. Most people think the tide is just water moving in and out, but tonight, we shall see that the tide is actually a memory trying to find its way home. Please, keep your voices low. The water is listening. I want you to look at the door of the hut. Notice how it doesn't quite swing inward? It leans as if it is listening to something inside. Now, let us imagine we are walking inside together. The air here smells of brine and old copper. It is quiet, save for the rhythmic slap of the waves against the pilings below. And here, in the center of the room, we find our first guest. It is not a person, exactly. It is a swarm of hundreds of tiny, iridescent spheres, each no larger than a marble. They are a deep, bruised violet, and they move with a liquid grace, rolling over one another like a tide of pearls. They don't speak, but they hum. They represent the One. They insist, with every vibration of their bodies, that they are a single, unified being. They are the guest. But as we stand here, something strange happens. Look at the person to your left. Look at the person to your right. I want you to think of your favorite childhood summer, that specific afternoon when the sun felt warm on your neck and you ate a slice of peaches. Now, look at the stranger standing next to you. Ask them what their favorite childhood summer was. They will tell you. And then, I want you to ask the person next to them. Each of us is sharing a memory of the same peach orchard, the same golden light, the same sticky sweetness. But none of us actually grew up near an orchard. None of us ever ate those peaches. It is a memory we are all borrowing from the guest. The spheres are pulsating faster now, turning from violet to a deep, aching amber. They are rolling toward us, spilling out of the hut like a slow-motion waterfall of marbles. They want to share the peach orchard with us. They want to be the reason we remember it. As they touch your skin, you feel a slight vibration, a hum that resonates in your teeth. They are moving faster now, a frantic, tumbling dance. They aren't just rolling. They are weaving themselves into the shape of a human face, though they never quite hold it for more than a second. They're a face of pearls, a face of spheres, a face of shifting geometry. They want you to know that they were there with you, in that orchard, even though they were never there before you entered this hut. They are weaving the past into the present. They are stitching your memories to their own bodies. They are claiming your history as their own territory. They move closer, a riot of amber spheres, clicking against the wooden floor like 1,000 tiny teeth. They're moving toward the door now, wanting to follow us back onto the pier. They want to stay in your heads, even when the hut is left behind. They want to be the constant hum in your ears as you walk home. You can feel them now, a heavy weight in the air, a crowd of small things demanding to be one big thing. They are pressing against your chests, filling the gaps in your minds. They are the guest, and they are finally home. When we leave this pier and walk back into the village, the people will look at you and see the way your eyes shine. They will see the way you hold your hands as if you are still touching a fruit that isn't there. They will know you visited the hut. But when you close your eyes at night, you will hear the spheres. They will be rolling in the back of your skull, rearranging your memories until every peach you ever ate tastes like the guest's amber light. They are satisfied now, settled into the architecture of your mind. They are no longer just a swarm. They are the very fabric of your lived experience. You will never have a memory that is truly yours again, for every thought you have will be whispered by the swarm, reminding you that they were there to witness it. The inheritance of the oil painting. The mining camp at Blackwood Creek was supposed to be a ghost town for exactly 48 hours. The machinery had been packed, the lanterns extinguished, and the 60 men who had spent the month carving veins of copper from the earth had retreated to the village below. I was the last one left, tasked with the final inventory before the heavy iron gates were locked for the season. The silence was heavy, a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. It felt as though the earth was holding its breath, waiting for the vibrations of the drills to stop permanently. In the center of the main mess hall hung a single, massive oil painting that the foreman had insisted we keep. It depicted a woman standing in a field of wheat, her face turned slightly toward the viewer. She was beautiful in a sturdy, practical way, her hair woven with copper wire, her gown a deep shade of moss green. At least, that is what I saw when I first arrived. I spent the first night in the mess hall, listening to the timber groan. That was when I first noticed the shift. It wasn't a sudden movement, but a subtle, fluid transition. I woke up at 3 a.m. to find that the woman in the painting was no longer looking at the viewer. She was looking at the corner of the room where I sat. Her face was slightly more wrinkled than it had been at sunset. She looked weary, as if she had just finished a long day of walking. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it was a trick of the moonlight, but when I looked again, her hair had lost 3 of its copper wires. She looked older, her jawline sharper, her skin more mapped with fine lines. I realized then that she wasn't just a portrait, she was a thief. She was stealing my years. Every time I blinked, she took a piece of my youth and added it to her own canvas. By the second night, the shift became aggressive. The mining camp felt smaller, the air thicker with the scent of old oil and damp stone. I felt a dull ache in my joints that hadn't been there before. My own skin felt slightly tighter, as if it were being stretched by an invisible hand. The woman in the painting was now middle-aged. Her moss-green gown had faded to a dusty olive, and her expression had shifted from serene to slightly annoyed. She seemed to resent the fact that I was the one providing her with the fuel of time. I tried to move to the bunkhouse, but my legs felt heavy, and my breath came in shorter bursts. Every step I took felt like a negotiation with the painting. "Are you taking it all?" I whispered to the empty room. The painting didn't answer with words, but her eyes, a warm, honeyed amber, seemed to glow with a faint, internal heat. By the third night, the atmosphere became suffocating. The mining camp was no longer a place of work. It was a jar containing a ticking clock. I sat in a chair, barely able to move, as the woman reached her twilight years. Her hair was now a silvered crown, and her face was a map of deep furrows and wisdom. I felt my own hair thinning, and the faint lines of my forehead deepening into permanent creases. I was losing the vitality of my 20s to her, feeding her the vibrant energy of my morning. I watched her hands in the painting. They were gnarled and graceful, like the roots of an ancient oak. She looked satisfied, almost smug, as she drank in the seconds I threw at her. I realized then that the foreman hadn't chosen her because she was beautiful. He had chosen her because she was hungry. She was the keeper of the time we spent in this camp, and she was greedy for every second of it. As the final hour of the last night approached, the painting underwent its final transformation. She was no longer a woman in a field. She was a matriarch of the earth, her face a masterpiece of experience. My own body felt exhausted, as if I had lived a decade in 3 days. I stood up, my knees popping, and looked at her one last time before the sun rose. She was old now, her skin like fine parchment, her smile a gentle curve of triumph. She had taken what she needed, leaving me with the leftovers of a stolen life. I walked out of the mess hall and into the morning air, feeling every year she had stolen from my bones. I reached out to touch the frame, but my hand hesitated. As I turned to leave, I noticed the woman's eyes were no longer looking at the room or the viewer. They were focused intently on the door, waiting for me to open it so she could step out and claim the rest of the world. The resident of the Reach. Log entry 1:04 a.m. The house is exhaling. I am standing in the kitchen, the linoleum cool beneath my socks. Everything is still, yet the silence feels heavy, as if the air itself has gained mass. I reached for the kettle, but as my fingers brushed the ceramic handle, I felt a slight tug. Not a physical pull, like a string, but a subtle subtraction. A small sound, the click of the lid, seemed to vanish before it could reach the far corner of the room. It didn't echo. It simply dissolved. Log entry 2:04 and 8 seconds a.m. There is something here. It is not a ghost in the traditional sense. It does not float or haunt. It is a person-shaped quiet. It sits in the corner by the pantry. It has no face, yet it has a posture, a slight slouch of the shoulders, a curve of the spine that suggests a body made of velvet and heavy wool. It doesn't have a skin of its own. Rather, it seems to be composed of the absence of noise. When it moves, it doesn't scrape against the floor. It glides, drinking the friction. Log entry 3:04 and 15 seconds a.m. I tried to speak. I whispered, "Is someone there?" The word "there" barely left my lips before the entity caught it. It hovered in the space between my mouth and the wall, expanding like a bubble of ink and water. The entity didn't just hear the word, it consumed the vibration. I could see the sound physically enter its chest. It has a ribcage that looks like a cage of woven reeds, and every time it inhales a noise, the reeds pulse with a faint, amber warmth. It is getting closer. It is now standing 3 feet away, within my reach. Log entry 4:04 and 22 seconds a.m. The sensation is beginning. It is no longer just an observer. I feel a strange weight in my own marrow. My left arm feels heavier than my right. My pulse is slowing, but my heartbeat feels muffled, as if it is occurring underwater. I suspect the entity is starting to settle into my bones. It is migrating from its own hollow frame into my physical structure. I can feel its velvet texture lining the inside of my ribs. Log entry 5:04 and 30 seconds a.m. I tried to move my hand toward the kettle again, but the movement felt borrowed. My fingers didn't just curl, they snapped into place with a precision that felt slightly alien. The entity is now leaning against my shoulder. It doesn't have a head in the way I do, but a rounded, smooth dome of textured felt that smells faintly of old parchment and rain. It is drinking my own thoughts now. Every internal monologue is being snatched away the moment it forms, leaving my mind a pristine, silent gallery. Log entry 6:04 and 38 seconds a.m. My skin is beginning to change. Where the entity touches me, my skin feels less like flesh and more like pressed fabric. The pores are smoothing out. I can feel the person-shaped quiet weaving itself into my skeleton, replacing my calcium with something more porous and receptive. My humerus bone feels like a hollow flute. When I breathe, I don't just exhale air. I exhale the ghost of the sounds I've lost. Log entry 7:04 and 45 seconds a.m. The kitchen is nearly void of noise. I tried to hum a melody, but the entity caught the first note and swallowed it whole. Now I am a vessel. I can feel the entity's posture merging with mine. When I sit, my spine doesn't just bend. It folds with a soft, muffled grace that belongs to it. My identity is becoming a shared property. I am no longer just a human standing in a kitchen. I am a human-shaped container for a quiet that was once separate. Log entry 8:04 and 52 seconds a.m. The sensation of settling is becoming intense. It feels like a house shrinking around its inhabitants. My joints ache with a delicious, heavy satisfaction. The entity is no longer a separate entity standing beside me. It is moving inward, spiraling into my sternum. I can feel its reed-like ribs interlocking with my own. I am losing the sharp edges of my own being. My hands feel soft, almost blurry at the tips. I am becoming a person of fewer sounds and more presence. Log entry 9:04 and 58 seconds a.m. I reached out to touch the table, and the sound of my palm hitting the wood was devoured. Instantly, there was no thud. There was only the feeling of the contact. My arm felt long and elegant, swaying with a momentum that wasn't entirely my own. The entity is almost fully submerged within me now. My chest feels full, as if I am carrying a heavy, velvet-lined secret. The kitchen is a vacuum of perfect peace. Log entry 10:05 a.m. The transition is complete. I am standing perfectly still. I no longer feel the need to move, for the movement is already held within me. I am the quiet. The kitchen is empty, yet it feels crowded with the weight of what I have absorbed. I reached out to take a breath, but I realized I didn't have to make a sound to know it was there. I looked down at my hands and realized they were no longer my own. They were the soft, heavy hands of the thing that lived in the corner. I am the host now, but the guest has finally moved into the master bedroom of my soul, and it is currently nibbling on the very last of my internal thoughts. The register of the unlived room. The salt flats are not just white, they're a void that swallows sound. Standing in the center of the expanse at 3 in the morning, the ground feels like a sheet of frozen glass beneath my boots. My Aunt Martha had always insisted that I visit this place, not because it was beautiful, but because she claimed it was the only place where the memories of the unlived house could actually breathe. I never lived in that house, yet she described its hallways with such agonizing precision that I could almost feel the velvet of the wallpaper and smell the scent of beeswax. It was a house of potential, she would whisper, her eyes clouding over. A house where every door led to a room you hadn't stepped into yet. I stood in the silence, the horizon a seamless seam between the white earth and the ink-black sky. That was when I found the register. It sat on a small, weathered stool in the middle of nowhere, a leather-bound book with pages that felt like pressed skin. I opened it to find a list of names, a school attendance register from a classroom that never existed. Most of the names were familiar, but near the bottom, there was a solitary name with no teacher's mark beside it. It simply read, "The guest who stayed." As I read the name, the air temperature plummeted. A sound began to emerge from the salt, a rhythmic, mechanical clicking, like the ticking of a clock submerged in water. From the direction of the northern horizon, a figure began to move. It wasn't walking so much as it was appearing in pulses. It moved in the frozen stutter of a call with no signal. One moment it was a distant silhouette, the next it was 20 feet closer, skipping the space in between. It was my Aunt Martha's other self, the woman who inhabited the Unlived house. She didn't have a human face in the traditional sense. Her features were arranged in a permanent state of shifting. Her skin looked like hammered copper, and her hair was a thick mane of white silk that didn't flow with the wind, but stayed perfectly still as she moved. She wore a dress made of heavy, overlapping scales that shimmered with the color of a bruised plum. "Do you like the foyer?" she asked. Her voice didn't travel through the air. It vibrated inside my ribcage. Her mouth didn't move to form the words, yet they echoed clearly. "It's beautiful," I replied, my breath hitching. She took another stuttering step forward. Now she was only 5 feet away. Her body didn't slide. It jumped forward in 3-inch increments, each jump accompanied by a soft thrum sound. She reached out a hand. Her palm was wide and flat, covered in tiny, iridescent bumps like the surface of a seashell. She didn't have 5 fingers. She had 3 broad ones that moved with a fluid, undulating grace. "You never lived there," she observed, her copper skin glowing under the moon. "But you're the only one who can see the furniture." I looked around. The salt flat was no longer empty. Because she was standing there, the Unlived house was unfolding around us. I saw a heavy oak table appearing in the salt, then a chair, then a chandelier made of frozen teardrops. They weren't solid. They were semi-transparent, flickering like a dream you try to remember just as you wake up. "I remember the kitchen," I said, surprised by the honesty of my own voice. "The one with the blue chairs." She flickered again, moving even closer until her copper face was inches from mine. Her eyes weren't spheres. They were 2 narrow slits of glowing amber that seemed to track the movement of my thoughts rather than my physical body. "The chairs were blue because the house was waiting for you to sit in them." She reached out and touched my shoulder. Her skin was unexpectedly warm, smelling of old parchment and rain. As her hand lingered, the furniture began to dissolve into white dust, and the salt flat returned to its lonely, silent state. She stayed for a moment longer, her copper face reflecting the vastness of the empty land. "I am the memory of what could have been," she whispered. She took one final stuttering leap and vanished into the horizon, leaving behind nothing but a faint dusting of copper-colored powder on the white ground. I stood alone in the center of the flats, the register still open in my hands. I realized then that she wasn't a ghost of the past, but a resident of the almost. I looked down at the register again to see if her name had finally appeared with a mark, but the page was blank. I realized then that the house wasn't just waiting for me to visit, it was waiting for me to inhabit it, and now that she had shown me the foyer, I could never truly see a regular room the same way again. I turned to walk back toward the edge of the flats, but as I moved, I felt a slight weight on my shoulder, as if she were still there, walking just half a step behind me. I looked back, and though the salt was empty, I could see the faint, shimmering outline of a chair appearing in the dust where she had last stood. I closed my eyes and realized that even though she was gone, the house was now permanently built inside my own head, and every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the sound of a door opening in a room I had never actually entered. The lease of the lungs. The house was a bargain, a sprawling Victorian carcass of timber and dust that smelled of linseed oil and old secrets. It was the kind of place that felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for a tenant to finally settle into its ribcage. I found the crawlspace on the 3rd day of unpacking. It was a narrow, earthen vein running beneath the master bedroom, accessible only by a heavy wooden hatch. It was supposed to be a storage spot for boots and winter blankets, but as I lowered myself into the cramped, dirt-floored gallery, the air felt thick, Not with dust, but with a humid, rhythmic pulse. That was the first time I felt it. A steady, rhythmic inhale and exhale that didn't seem to belong to my own chest. I assumed it was the house settling, the wood expanding and contracting, but the sound was too organic. It was a wet, soft sound, like a bellows made of velvet. Resting in the center of the dirt floor was a small, smooth stone. On one side, a number was etched in precise, tiny script, 10,000. I didn't know what it meant then, but I knew it was a countdown. Every time I entered the crawlspace, the number would decrease by 1. It felt like a gift from the previous owner, a tiny mystery to solve as I unpacked my life above. By the second week, the countdown was at 5,000. The breathing became more distinct. It wasn't just a background noise, it was a physical presence. It felt like a pair of invisible lungs were expanding against the back of my neck. I started to notice the texture of the space. The walls weren't just dirt, they were lined with a fine, shimmering fuzz, like the underside of a moth's wing. And then I heard the first inconsistency. I had stopped moving, my heart steady, my breath rhythmic. But the breathing in the crawl space continued for a fraction of a second after I had finished my own exhale. It was a tiny, lingering puff of air, a ghost of a breath. I sat still, my heart hammering. The crawl space was catching up to me. One night, while the rain tapped a frantic tattoo against the floorboards above, I crawled down into the dark. The countdown was at 200. The air felt warmer now, almost feverish. I reached out to touch the wall, and my hand sank into the fuzz. It wasn't just a coating, it was hair. Thousands of microscopic, copper-colored hairs were rooted into the earth, swaying toward my palm as if sensing my warmth. That was when I saw it. It wasn't a ghost or a solid beast. It was a mass of iridescent, translucent membranes, shaped like a cluster of oversized, weeping willow leaves, suspended in the center of the space. It had no face, no limbs, and no clear skeleton. It was a creature of surface area and surface tension, shimmering with a pearlescent oil slick. It didn't have eyes to watch me, it had pores that rippled. As I watched, the membranes pulsed. It was sinking. It was mimicking my lungs. Every time I took a deep breath, the creature expanded, its membranes stretching until they were almost transparent. Every time I exhaled, it collapsed inward with a soft, sighing hiss. The countdown was at 50. I felt a strange, symbiotic intimacy with it. It felt like a partner, a silent roommate who shared my oxygen. I began to spend more time down there, the bedroom above becoming less important. I found myself leaning my head against the copper hairs, listening to the perfect harmony of our respiration. The entity was learning the cadence of my life. It wasn't just copying the sound, it was copying the weight. When I breathed out, it seemed to carry the momentum of my breath, pulling the air into its own shimmering folds. The countdown reached 10. I felt a sense of impending completion, a finality that made my stomach tighten. I lay on my back in the dirt, my chest rising and falling in a slow, deliberate tempo. The creature hovered above me, its membranes vibrating like the strings of a cello. It was no longer just following me, it was anticipating me. It would begin its inhale a millisecond before my own lungs opened. It was preparing to take over. The countdown hit. 1. I closed my eyes, prepared to take one last, deep breath to signal the end. I drew the air in, filling my chest to its limit, and then I let it out in a long, steady stream. But as the air left my lips, the creature didn't wait for me to finish. It surged forward, its membranes wrapping around my ribcage like a wet silk scarf. It didn't just take my breath, it took the source of it. My lungs suddenly felt heavy, as if they were being squeezed by invisible hands. I tried to inhale again, but there was no air left in the room. The creature had inhaled the very air I was about to use. The countdown hit 0. The silence that followed was absolute. I lay there in the dirt, my chest barely moving, my lungs feeling strangely hollow. I realized then that the entity wasn't a companion, it was a successor. It had been waiting for the countdown to reach 0 so it could claim the lease of my body. I felt a new sensation then, a subtle, rhythmic tugging from inside my chest. My lungs were still moving, but I wasn't the one controlling them anymore. The creature was still there, tucked inside the space between my ribs, and it had just started its own long, slow exhale. I realized with a jolt of terror that my own heart had stopped beating, but I was still breathing. The Anticipatory Grin. The road ends exactly 40 miles before the village of Oakhaven begins. It is a jagged, crumbling artery of asphalt that eventually surrenders to a vast, undulating plain of tall grass and permafrost. I chose the border weather station because it promised isolation, a place where the atmosphere was the only inhabitant. The station is a squat, hexagonal building of corrugated iron and thick glass, perched on a ridge where the wind seems to have a voice of its own. For the first week, it was perfect. I spent my days recording pressure drops and temperature spikes, my only company being the steady hum of the anemometers and the rhythmic ticking of the internal clock. Then, the silence began to feel heavy, as if the air were thickening into a physical weight. It started with the morning routine in the small washroom. There is a tall, rectangular mirror bolted to the wall above the basin. I would splash water on my face, towel off, and look up. That was when I first noticed the delay. I would blink, and for a fraction of a second, my reflection would still have its eyes closed. It was a microscopic lag, a stutter in the logic of the world. I assumed it was an optical illusion, a trick of the dim light, until the third day. I pulled my lips back into a wide grin to test it. My reflection's mouth didn't move until I had already begun to exhale. It was as if my face was the leader and my reflection was a diligent, slightly exhausted follower. By the second week, the delay became a constant, haunting rhythm. I would raise an eyebrow, and the mirror me would wait for a heartbeat before arching its own. I would turn my head left, and the reflection would follow, a hair's breadth behind my own movement. It was as if the image in the glass was watching me, waiting for my signal before it dared to imitate me. Then, the proportions began to shift. My reflection was no longer a perfect twin. It was a figure of crooked, childlike geometry. Its torso was slightly too short, its elbows bent at sharp, unnatural angles, and its head sat a bit too low on its neck. It looked like a sketch drawn by a child who had seen a human but wasn't entirely sure how much space to give the limbs. It stood at my full height, yet it possessed the chunky, clumsy grace of a toddler. One morning, I stopped moving entirely. I stood perfectly still, staring into the glass. My reflection didn't just follow, it shifted. It stood with its arms slightly wider than mine, its chest puffed out just a fraction more. And then, the smile. I was expressionless, a neutral mask of concentration. But in the mirror, the entity's mouth was pulled back into a wide, crescent-shaped curve. It wasn't my smile. It was its smile, wider, more deliberate, and slightly more hungry. I felt a prickle of heat on the back of my neck. I decided to test the limits of the lag. I reached out and pressed my palm against the cool surface of the glass. The reflection did the same, but its hand touched the surface a heartbeat later. As I pulled my hand away, the reflection stayed there for a moment longer, its palm lingering against the glass, as if it were reluctant to let go of the contact. That night, the wind died down completely, leaving the station in a vacuum of sound. I lay in my cot, eyes fixed on the mirror across the room. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath. The entity in the glass was sitting on the floor of the reflection, its crooked knees pulled up to its chest. It was watching me. Then it did something impossible. It didn't wait for me to move. It leaned forward, its heavy, rounded head swaying. It opened its mouth. It didn't have teeth like mine. It had small, blunt bumps like a row of smooth pebbles. It smiled, and the expression reached all the way to its ears. I felt a sudden, sharp tug on my own face, as if something were pulling my muscles toward the glass. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs. The reflection stood up too, its movements jerky and uncoordinated. It took a step forward, its foot crossing the invisible boundary of the glass. Its toe poked into my world, a solid, physical point of contact. I could see the way its skin wrinkled where it met the air of the room. It was no longer just a ghost of my movements. It was a predator waiting for its turn. I realized then that it wasn't just imitating me. It was practicing. It was learning my mannerisms, studying the way I lived, preparing for the moment it would finally be able to step out of the frame and take my place. I closed my eyes, terrified to see what it would do next. When I opened them, the mirror was empty. The reflection was gone. I stood up, my breath hitching in my throat. I felt a weight on my shoulder, a slight pressure of something solid. I turned my head slightly to the left, and there it was, standing just behind my left ear. It was no longer in the mirror. It was in the room, its crooked proportions casting a shadow against the wall. It reached out a hand, not a long, thin one, but a short, thick palm with blunt nails, and touched my cheek. It didn't move its mouth when I did, it just waited. It leaned in close, its pebble-like teeth gleaming in the dim light. It was perfectly still, mimicking my posture exactly, down to the tilt of my chin. Then it opened its mouth to show me its full, crooked grin. I realized with a jolt of terror that it wasn't just waiting for my movements anymore. It was waiting for me to stop moving entirely so it could finally take my next breath. I felt it inhale, a soft, whistling sound that didn't come from my own lungs. The lag in the lens. Dispatch, 911, what is your location and nature of emergency? Caller, I am at Relay Station 42. High altitude. It is currently being hammered by a massive ice storm. The wind is howling against the steel, but inside, it is eerily quiet. I am alone. Dispatch, understood. Please describe your current situation. Caller, I am sitting in the small observation room. It is cramped, filled with monitors and humming cables. I have a laptop open, streaming a live feed of this very room. It is strange, though. The camera angle is impossible. It is positioned in the upper left corner of the ceiling, but it isn't just looking down at me. It is looking at me from a point that feels like it is tucked just behind my own left shoulder, yet it is technically above me. It captures the desk, my chair, and the way the frost is creeping across the glass panes. Dispatch, you mentioned the camera angle is impossible. Can you elaborate? Caller, it feels like the camera is seeing something just behind my physical body that my eyes can't quite catch. Like it is looking through a thin veil. But that isn't what is bothering me. It is what is happening on the screen. I am watching myself on the monitor. I am sitting, typing, and blinking. But my reflection, the me on the screen, is slightly delayed. When I blink, the version on the screen waits a fraction of a second before its eyelids drop. It is a subtle lag. A half-second delay. Dispatch, a delay? Is it consistent? Caller, at first, it was almost imperceptible. I thought it was just a glitch in the transmission. But as the storm outside gets heavier, the lag is growing. I raised my right hand to scratch my chin. On the screen, the me on the monitor waited, then lifted its hand. Now, when I move, the reflection takes nearly a full second to follow. It feels like the version on the screen is watching me, waiting for my permission to move. It is mimicking my every motion, but it feels heavy. Like it is trying to keep up with a pace it can't quite sustain. Dispatch, is the reflection perfectly identical to you? Caller, almost. But there are differences. My reflection skin has a slight, waxy texture, like a moth's wing. And instead of hair, it has a crown of fine, copper-colored filaments that twitch independently of my own. Its mouth is slightly wider than mine, and when it smiles, it shows a row of tiny, square teeth that look like pearls. It isn't a twin. It is a slower, more deliberate copy. Dispatch, you seem increasingly uneasy. Is the reflection moving on its own yet? Caller, yes. That is what just happened. I stopped moving entirely. I held my breath. I sat perfectly still, staring at the monitor. But on the screen, my reflection didn't stop. It took a tiny step forward. It leaned its face closer to the glass of the screen. Its copper filaments vibrated. It stayed there, hovering just an inch closer to the front than I was. It is beginning to gain ground. Dispatch, can you describe its expression? Caller, it looks hungry. Not for food, but for synchronization. It is trying to close the gap. Every time it moves closer, the lag feels different. It doesn't feel like a delay anymore. It feels like a pursuit. I can hear a faint sound now, even though the room is silent. It is a soft, wet clicking sound, like a clock ticking underwater. It happens every time the reflection moves. Dispatch, is it getting closer to the front of the screen? Caller, it is. I am starting to feel a strange pressure in the air. The room feels heavier. I am terrified to move because if I move, it will move too. But it is no longer waiting for me to lead. It is starting to initiate its own actions. It just raised its hand and touched the surface of the screen from the inside. At the same time, I felt a faint, cold pressure on my own cheek, as if something was touching me from the opposite side of the air. Dispatch, do you see it moving toward the edge? Caller, it is almost out. The me on the screen is reaching out, its pearl-like teeth bared in a wide, expectant grin. The lag is almost gone. The delay is down to a mere blink. It is no longer following, it is arriving. I can see its copper filaments brushing against the bottom of the frame. It is pushing against the boundary of the screen, trying to spill into my room. Dispatch, what is happening now? Caller, it just broke through. It didn't just move on the screen, it emerged. It is standing right in front of me now, though it is slightly larger than it was inside the frame. It has no shadow, yet it casts a faint, pale light on the desk. It reached out and took my hand. Its skin felt like damp silk. It didn't just mirror my grip, it pulled me toward it. Dispatch, is it your twin? Caller, it is mine. But it is finally my turn to be the reflection. I can feel my body becoming slightly blurred, my edges softening as I am pulled into the monitor. I am becoming the image, and it is becoming the flesh. It is standing in my chair now, breathing my air. It looked at me one last time before I fully slipped into the glass. Dispatch, describe the final state. Caller, it is sitting in my chair, perfectly still. It is looking at the screen, where I am now trapped, watching it from the other side. It has its hand on the glass. It just blinked, and it took a full 3 seconds for my eyes to follow. It is waiting for me to move next, but I am no longer the one in control. It is smiling at me, and I am realizing that when it finally moves to step into my world, I will be the one left behind in the lag, forever waiting for it to catch up. The geometry of the marsh. The airboat engine groaned and sputtered one last time before the vibration died, leaving me in a silence so heavy it felt tactile. I stood on the timber boardwalk, the last human soul in the Weeping Fin. The fog was a thick, woolen blanket, smelling of damp earth and decaying lilies. I took a step forward, and the wood groaned under my boot. To my left, the swamp was a soup of tangled cypress knees and hanging moss. To my right, the mist swallowed the horizon. I started walking, intending to reach the stone bridge at the far end, but the fog seemed to breathe with me. Every time I thought I saw the familiar curve of the path, the mist would shift, swallowing the wood I had just stepped on and revealing a new, twisting stretch of timber ahead. It was as if the boardwalk was being rewritten by an invisible hand. I turned north, but the path curved east. I turned east, but it elongated into a straight line that felt like it was stretching into infinity. The further I walked, the more the familiar landmarks vanished. The large willow tree I had passed at the start was gone, replaced by a cluster of jagged reeds. The wide clearing was now a narrow, claustrophobic corridor of rotting planks. It felt like the swamp was actively rerouting me, stripping away the geometry of my memory until I was lost in a labyrinth that had no beginning and no end. Then, the sound started. It wasn't a bird or a frog. It was a rhythmic, wet clicking, like smooth stones being tapped together. I stopped. From the mist emerged a flock of white herons, their feathers dusted with silver frost. They didn't fly. They moved with a synchronized, gliding gait. They were massive, their wingspan wide enough to cast shadows over the boardwalk. They moved toward me, then suddenly stopped in a perfect semicircle. They began to move in a slow, deliberate dance, shifting their positions one by one. They weren't just wandering, they were constructing. They tucked their heads down, their wings folding like paper fans, and they rearranged themselves into a sequence of shapes. At first, it was just a cluster of dots. Then, the dots elongated into lines. The herons shifted until they formed a perfect, jagged silhouette against the fog. I blinked, and my heart hammered against my ribs. They had formed the shape of a name. It was written in the air, a sequence of letters made of white feathers and long necks. It was my own name. Elias, I whispered to the stillness. The flock held the shape for a heartbeat, the letters shimmering, Then the herons suddenly erupted into the air, their cries echoing like a chorus of flutes. As the sound faded, a figure stepped out from the center of the flock. It was not a man, but it was humanoid. It stood about 7 feet tall, its skin the color of wet slate. It had no hair, and its face was wide and flat, with a mouth that was a simple horizontal slit. But the most striking feature was its neck. From the base of its primary neck, a second, smaller torso budded out like a sprout on a tree. This smaller torso was twisted slightly to the left, possessing its own set of forearms and a tiny oval head. While the large head moved with a slow, heavy grace, the smaller head spun rapidly in circles, its mouth twitching. It didn't walk so much as it flowed across the boardwalk, its two bodies moving in a strange, counter-rhythmic harmony. The primary torso reached out with a hand that had only 3 thick knuckles, while the smaller torso used its forearms to pull itself forward, its tiny head watching me with a sense of intense, hungry focus. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. The entity didn't speak, but the smaller torso opened its tiny mouth and emitted a sound like a flute played underwater. It moved closer, the primary head tilting slightly while the smaller head spun faster and faster until it became a blur of motion. It reached the edge of the boardwalk and paused. The larger torso extended a hand toward my chest, while the smaller torso reached up to touch my chin. It felt like the entity was trying to read my pulse. Then it did something unexpected. It leaned forward, and the smaller torso detached slightly from the main neck, swaying like a pendulum. It tapped my chin 3 times, then pulled back. The entity let out a low, vibrating hum that shook the very wood beneath my feet. The fog began to thicken again, pressing in from all sides. The herons returned, landing one by one around the figure. The entity didn't look back at them. It simply stood there, its 2 heads, one large and contemplative, one small and frantic, watching me. I realized then that the name it had formed wasn't just a label. It was a summons. The entity wasn't a resident of the swamp. It was the architect of the maze, and it had been waiting for me to find its house. It took one final step, its primary hand enveloping mine. The grip was cool and felt like smooth river stone. As I looked into the large, slit-like eyes, I realized that the name it had formed wasn't just my name. It was a command. The entity opened its large mouth wide, and for the first time, I heard its voice, a hollow, multi-layered echo that seemed to come from both heads at once. Stay, it vibrated. The figure then merged back into the mist, its 2 torsos swaying in unison as it retreated. The herons took flight, their white bodies vanishing into the gray. I stood alone on the boardwalk, the silence returning, heavier than before. The fog began to pull back, revealing the way home, but the path was no longer a mystery. It was a permanent mark on the earth. I turned to walk away, but as I took my first step, I noticed the texture of the wood had changed. It was no longer timber. It was now made of the same wet, slate-colored skin as the entity. I looked back and realized that wherever the entity had walked, the boardwalk had become its body, and it was still growing. The geometry of the Watcher. I thought the silence of the Copper Ridge mining camp would be peaceful. After 3 months of the rhythmic thud of hammers and the shouting of men, the night after the final shift felt like a held breath. The iron lanterns were dimmed, the heavy carts were locked in place, and the smell of pulverized stone hung in the air like a dusty veil. I stayed behind as the night watchman, tasked with ensuring the structure didn't settle too violently in the sudden quiet. By midnight, the moon hung like a heavy coin over the jagged peaks. That is when I first saw it. It wasn't a ghost or a lingering shadow, but a physical presence standing by the main smelting forge. It was a person-shaped thing, but the anatomy was fundamentally scrambled. Its head was not atop its neck. Instead, it sat firmly where a right shoulder should be, pointing outward toward the cavern mouth. Its torso was elongated, composed of a texture resembling weathered bark fused with hammered brass. It didn't walk so much as it shuffled, its limbs moving in a sequence that defied standard biology. I gripped my torch, the flame dancing against the stillness. "Who goes there?" I called out, my voice feeling heavy in the cavernous space. The creature didn't speak, but it reacted. It moved toward the center of the camp, its body twisting in a way that made my stomach turn. It had no face in the traditional sense, no nose or chin, only a wide, horizontal slit that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic amber light. But its eyes were the most unsettling part. It had 12 of them, arranged in a cluster along its ribcage. They were not static. When it looked at me, all 12 eyes rotated in perfect synchronization. They didn't blink at different intervals. They moved as a single, unified unit, like a dozen marbles caught in a single piece of silk. It was the movement of a pack of wolves condensed into one torso. As the creature moved closer, the air grew thick with the scent of ozone and wet wool. It stopped 10 feet away. Its head, the one on its shoulder, swung around to face me, while its ribcage eyes continued to track my movements. It felt as though I was being scrutinized by a committee of judges who all thought at the exact same moment. "Are you the owner of the camp?" I whispered, my breath hitching. The creature responded by expanding. Its brass-like skin rippled, and the 12 eyes widened. They began to pulse faster. I realized then that it wasn't just watching me, it was absorbing the layout of the camp. Every time its eyes swept across a rusted shovel or a broken crate, the amber light in its ribcage flickered. It was mapping the silence. Then, the most terrifying thing happened. It stopped its independent movement. Its head on its shoulder remained fixed on me, but its body began to vibrate. The 12 eyes began to move independently, even though the head was still. One eye looked at the ceiling, one at the ground, one at my left hand, and another at my right foot. They were scanning, processing, and recording. Then, suddenly, they all snapped back to the center, focusing on my face with a violent, synchronized jerk. I felt a strange pressure in my ears, a hum that seemed to vibrate from the creature's very marrow. It was as if it were trying to remember what it was supposed to be. It took a step forward, its head on its shoulder swaying like a pendulum. "Stay back," I commanded, though my legs felt heavy, as if the creature were pulling me toward it with a magnetic force. It reached out with a limb that had 3 joints instead of 2. The tip of the limb didn't have a hand, but a cluster of soft, velvet-like protrusions. It touched the ground, and the 12 eyes surged forward, all of them narrowing until they were thin slivers of light. The creature let out a low, resonant chime, a sound like a glass spell struck underwater. In that moment, I understood its purpose. It wasn't a creature of the mind, it was a creature of the observation. It was a living lens. It had spent centuries, perhaps eons, waiting in the deep dark. For something to move, something to exist, something to be witnessed. It moved one final step, its body almost touching my chest. The 12 eyes flooded with a brilliant, blinding white light, all of them focusing on the very center of my pupils. The humming reached a crescendo, then vanished instantly into a vacuum of sound. The creature stood perfectly still, its head on its shoulder frozen in a permanent gaze, its body becoming as dull and matte as the surrounding stone. I reached out to touch its brassy side, but my hand hesitated. It felt cold, not the cold of ice, but the cold of a thing that had been waiting a very long time to be seen. I took a deep breath and finally found my voice. "Is it finished?" The creature didn't move, but the 12 eyes all blinked at once, a perfectly timed shutter click of light. I turned to leave, my boots crunching on the gravel. I looked back one last time before heading toward the exit. The creature was still there, but it had changed. Its brassy skin now bore the faint, shimmering outline of my own face, etched into its side like a memory. I walked out into the moonlight, the heavy doors of the mine groaning shut behind me. I thought I was alone in the night, but as I looked back, I saw the 12 eyes all tracking my retreat, moving as one until I reached the very edge of the camp. I walked home, but I could still feel it. I could feel the weight of those 12 eyes, still tracking me, even though it was no longer in my sight. I laid in bed that night, the silence of my room feeling different than the silence of the mine. I closed my eyes, expecting to see darkness, but instead, I saw that amber light. I realized then that the creature hadn't just watched me, it had captured a piece of me to keep. I fell into a deep sleep, and for the first time in my life, I didn't dream of moving, because I knew that somewhere in the dark, 12 eyes were watching me move. The buffer of the blinking face. The dust in the projection booth is thick enough to taste, a gritty coating of pulverized history that settles on your tongue with every breath. You are sitting alone in the high, cramped sanctuary of the Old Pines Drive-In, a skeletal remains of a cinema where the screen has been weathered into a pale, cracked canvas. Outside, the moonlight is a sharp blade cutting through the pine needles, but inside, the air is heavy with the scent of ozone and ancient velvet. You have spent 3 days here, tasked with finding the master reel, a legendary lost film rumored to have been projected once and then hidden away. The projector sits in the center of the room, a hulking iron beast of gears and pulleys. When you crank the handle, the light doesn't just hit the screen, it seems to bleed into the very air, casting long, twitching shadows against the timber walls. You find the film, a strip of silver nitrate that feels strangely warm to the touch, and thread it through the teeth of the machine. The first few seconds of footage are clear, a rolling meadow under a violet sky. But as you watch, the image begins to stutter. It isn't a mechanical hitch. The meadow remains perfectly still for 3 seconds, then suddenly jumps forward, skipping a chunk of movement. You realize with a jolt of unease that the film only buffers when you aren't looking at it. When your eyes are fixed on the screen, the motion is fluid, like water flowing over stones. The moment you blink or turn your head to check the gears, the image freezes, suspended in a state of potential motion. You begin to experiment. You stare at a falling leaf, and it drifts downward in a graceful arc. You blink, and the leaf is suddenly at the bottom of the frame. You turn your head to scratch your nose, and the leaf is gone, replaced by a sudden burst of motion where it had been a second before. It is as if the film is waiting for your attention to give it permission to exist. The rhythm of the projection starts to feel deliberate, almost sentient. You begin to feel a presence in the booth with you, though you cannot see it. The temperature drops, and a thin veil of condensation begins to form on the large, rectangular pane of glass that separates the booth from the main auditorium. At first, it is just a misty blur, but as you keep your eyes locked on the flickering light, the moisture begins to organize itself. It starts as a small bead of water in the center of the pane. Then it expands. It isn't just a smudge, it is a shape. You stare at it, and it remains a simple, round droplet. You blink, and the droplet has elongated into a horizontal line. You look away to adjust the focus knob, and when you return your gaze, the line has curdled into a jagged, textured surface. It is a face. This face is not painted on the glass. It is formed by the condensation itself, as if the moisture is being pushed outward by something on the other side. The face has a heavy, brow-ridged forehead and a mouth that looks like a series of overlapping scales. It doesn't have a nose, but rather a deep, swirling indentation where the moisture has pooled into a whirlpool. Most striking are the eyes. They are not circles, but deep, crystalline pits that seem to catch the light of the projector like facets of a cut diamond. You find yourself mesmerized. You hold your breath, focusing on the face. It stays perfectly still, a masterpiece of frozen humidity. You blink. The face is wider now, the mouth curving into a strange, lopsided grin. You look away to check the reel, and when you look back, the face has moved 3 inches to the left, though nothing physically pushed it. It is migrating across the glass. You begin to feel a frantic pulse in the booth, a low humming sound that vibrates in your teeth. The face on the glass begins to change more rapidly. Every time you look away, the facial features reorganize. The scales on the mouth become sharper, more like individual teeth. The diamond pits of the eyes begin to glow with a faint, interior light. It is reacting to your absence. It is hungry for the moments you aren't watching it. You decide to test the limit. You will stare at the face for a full minute without moving a muscle. The face remains a serene, watchful thing, its diamond eyes reflecting your own stunned expression. You close your eyes for one long, deliberate second. When you open them, the face is no longer in the center of the glass. It has surged toward the edge, its mouth stretched into a wide, cavernous yawn that reveals a row of irregular, pearl-like protrusions. The face is no longer just a shape, it is a personality. It seems to be mimicking the rhythm of the film, moving in sync with the jumps. You feel a sudden, sharp draft, as if the face on the glass is exhaling. You stare again. It is perfectly still. You blink. The face is now massive, filling nearly the entire pane of glass, its diamond eyes so large they seem to overlap. It looks less like a face and more like a mask of a creature you've never seen before. The hum in the room reaches a crescendo, and the light of the projector begins to pulse like a heartbeat. You realize that the face isn't just waiting for you to look away, it is waiting for you to stop looking altogether. You decide to perform one final test. You will turn your back completely to the glass, facing the projector and the reel. The humming dies down to a whisper. The air becomes heavy, like water pressing against your skin. You feel a strange sensation of being watched, a weight in the air behind you. You count to 3 in your head. 1, 2, 3. You spin around, your eyes flying to the glass. The face is gone. The condensation has evaporated, leaving the pane perfectly clear and dry. There is no moisture left, no diamond eyes, no scale-like mouth. The booth is silent. You exhale, a small smile forming on your lips as you think the entity has finally finished its performance. Then you notice the floor. In the dust where the glass pane meets the ground, there is a single, wet footprint, as if something had stepped out of the glass and onto the floor the moment you turned your back. The ink of the unseen guest. October 12th. I have been assigned to the records room of the Blackwood Asylum. The patients have all been moved to the new wing, leaving this subterranean chamber to the dust and the silence. It is a labyrinth of towering mahogany shelves, each groaning under the weight of leather-bound ledgers. My task is simple: catalog the remaining history of the residents. The air smells of old paper and a peculiar, metallic tang that feels like a lingering memory of iron. Today was the first day of the repetition. I spent the afternoon filing the melancholy cases. At 4 p.m., I noticed a small, ink-stained smudge on the corner of the central desk. It looked like a stray drop from a quill. I wiped it away, but by the time I reached for my lantern, the smudge had moved 3 inches to the left and deepened into a perfect, tiny circle. October 13th. The day repeated. I woke in the same chair, the same lantern in my hand. I spent the afternoon filing the melancholy cases again. At 4 p.m., I wiped away the ink smudge. It moved 3 inches to the left again, then settled into a circle. However, there was a new detail. A single, pressed violet lay on the floor. I remember picking it up and placing it on the shelf, but when I woke the next morning, the violet was back on the floor and the ink circle had shifted again, this time becoming a thin, horizontal line. October 14th. The repetition is becoming a rhythmic pulse. I filed the melancholy cases. The ink mark moved to the center of the desk and stretched into a jagged zigzag. The violet remained on the floor. I began to feel a slight pressure in the room, as if the air were thickening. It is not a heavy weight, but a presence, a sense of being observed by something that does not have the courtesy to show its face. I decided to test it. I wrote a single word in the margin of the ledger. Who? October 15th. I woke to the word who, still on the page. The ink mark was now a perfect square. But beneath my word, in a script that was unmistakably my own, the same slant, the same loop on the H, a new word had appeared. Near. I froze. I hadn't written near. I hadn't even touched the pen. I checked the ledger, then the desk, then the ceiling. Nothing had moved. The day repeated perfectly, down to the dust motes dancing in the lantern light. At 4 p.m., the ink square elongated into a rectangle, and the word near remained. October 16th. The day repeated, but the atmosphere shifted from curiosity to unease. I wrote how in the ledger. By the time I closed my eyes to sleep, the word near had shifted slightly to the right. When I woke, I found the word how and a new response beneath it, under. I spent the next hour searching. Under the desk? Under the floorboards? Under the heavy mahogany shelves? I found nothing. The records room was empty. Yet, the handwriting was so perfectly mine that it felt like a conversation with a twin I hadn't met yet. October 17th. The repetition felt heavier now. The silence was no longer empty. It felt occupied. I sat at the desk and watched the ink mark. It was no longer a rectangle. It had begun to pulse, expanding and contracting like a slow, rhythmic heartbeat. I wrote, where? I woke the next morning to find my response behind. I turned around. There was nothing but the towering shelf of anxiety cases. But as I watched, a tiny tremor ran through the wood of the shelf. It wasn't a vibration of the floor, but a ripple in the wood itself, as if something were pressing against it from the other side. October 18th. The day repeated, and the pulse of the ink mark grew stronger. It was no longer a shape, but a series of interconnected loops that looked like a tangled nest of vines. I felt a sudden, sharp draft of cold air hit the back of my neck. I didn't turn around. I knew that if I did, I would see it. October 19th. I decided to stop the game. I took my pen and wrote, "Show yourself." I closed my eyes, expecting a jump scare, a crash, or a whisper. Instead, there was only the sound of a wet, dragging motion, like a piece of heavy velvet being pulled across a stone floor. When I opened my eyes, the ink mark had transformed into a sprawling, chaotic web of lines that covered the entire surface of the desk. And there, at the very bottom of the ledger, was the final word I hadn't written: watch. I sat perfectly still. The lantern flickered. I could feel the pressure of the entity now, no longer just a feeling, but a physical weight pressing against my shoulder. It wasn't a ghost, and it wasn't a monster. It was a piece of me that had been separated from my body, a copy of my hand, my movement, and my intent, existing in the gaps between the seconds of the repeating day. I realized then that the entity wasn't just signing the book, it was learning how to inhabit my space. I reached out to touch the ink, but my hand trembled. The ink was still wet. It wasn't just sitting on the page, it was slowly crawling outward, reaching toward my fingertips like a tiny dark tide. I finally looked behind the shelf of anxiety. There was no creature, no face, and no body. There was only a faint, shimmering distortion in the air, a ripple in the reality of the room. But as I watched, a small, ink-stained hand made of pure, liquid shadow reached out from the distortion and gripped the edge of the desk. It didn't have fingers so much as it had points of pressure that moved with my own grace. It didn't have a face, yet I felt its gaze. It didn't have a voice, yet it spoke through the marks it left. It was the me that lived in the between. It had been waiting for me to notice it, to acknowledge the fact that I was no longer the only version of myself in this room. I took a deep breath and picked up my pen. I wanted to write one final thing, a final command to the shadow that shared my soul. I wrote, "Stay." I closed my eyes and waited for the day to repeat. When I opened them, the room was different. The repetition had finally broken. The shelves were gone, the lantern was extinguished, and the records were all blank. In the center of the room, the ink-stained hand was no longer reaching for the desk, it was reaching for my face. I felt the cold, wet sensation of ink meeting skin as the shadow finally touched my cheek, and I realized that the next time the day repeated, I would no longer be the one holding the pen. The Root-Bound Watcher. My grandmother's kitchen table was covered in a layer of flour when she handed me the recipe for the midnight scone. It was a simple enough pastry, yet she insisted that the secret wasn't in the butter or the yeast, but in the ritual of the bake. She spoke in low, rhythmic tones, her hands dusted white like a winter landscape. At the very bottom of the page, buried in a footnote so small it required a magnifying glass, was a warning: do not leave the dough to rise in a room with a ceiling, for the roots will eventually find the floor. And once they find the floor, the knuckle walker will find the heat. I didn't understand it then. I lived in a modern apartment, far from the ancient woods of her estate, and the idea of a room, growing roots, seemed like a poetic exaggeration rather than a literal command. But when I moved into the old, industrial water pumping station on the edge of town to work the night shift, the warning began to make sense. The station was a cavernous, concrete shell, largely unmanned, smelling of wet limestone and heavy oil. My job was simple: monitor the pressure gauges and ensure the subterranean pumps didn't seize. I lived in a small, elevated bunk in the center of the control room, a tiny wooden platform surrounded by humming machinery and the steady, rhythmic pulse of water moving through the veins of the earth. For the first month, it was peaceful. The hum of the pumps provided a constant, white noise lullaby that made the solitude of the night shift bearable. Then, the roots arrived. They didn't come from the ground, but from the very air. They were thick, fibrous veins of deep violet, growing downward from the ceiling like frozen lightning. They emerged first as tiny, hair-like threads, but they quickly thickened into muscular cords. Each night, they stretched an inch closer to my bunk. They didn't just hang, they reached with a sense of purpose, as if trying to grab the very air. They pulsed with a faint, bioluminescent glow, casting a ghostly purple hue over the control panels. By the third month, they were thick enough to brush against my face while I slept. They felt like wet velvet, smelling of wet earth and old copper, and they would occasionally twitch in my sleep as if reacting to the slightest breeze. I began to realize that the roots were seeking something. They weren't just growing, they were feeding on the vibration of the pumps, pulling the mechanical heartbeat of the station into their wooden bodies. But as the roots grew longer, the hum of the station changed. It became heavier, more deliberate. It sounded less like a machine and more like a rhythmic, labored breathing. The concrete walls seemed to vibrate with a deep, sub-bass thrum that I could feel in my teeth. That was the night the knuckle-walker first emerged from the shadows of the rafters. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. It had a wide, flat surface of textured leather where a forehead should be and 3 horizontal slits that served as nostrils. Its body was shaped like a massive, oversized pear covered in coarse, bronze fur that caught the dim light like a metallic fleece. But it was the hands that were terrifying. They were enormous, bulbous things that looked like smooth river stones. The knuckle-walker didn't move with its palms. It walked on its knuckles, which were each the size of a dinner plate and tipped with blunt, ivory studs. It moved with a heavy, deliberate thud-thud-thud, its body swaying like a pendulum. It didn't have a head so much as a sensory cluster that rotated on a stalk. It spent the first week simply watching me from the corner, its bronze fur shimmering in the dim light. It never made a sound, except for the occasional clack of its knuckles hitting the concrete floor. Each night, the roots would grow closer, and each night, the knuckle-walker would move one step nearer to my bunk. It was a slow, agonizing migration. I found myself holding my breath during the day, afraid that a sudden movement would alert it. By the 6th month, the roots were so dense they formed a canopy over my head, a forest of violet veins that trapped the scent of damp soil and created a private, humid world for my sleeping platform. The knuckle-walker was now just 3 feet from my bunk. I could hear its breathing, a low, wet whistle that seemed to sync with the rhythmic pulse of the pumps. One Tuesday, the pressure gauge on the main pump spiked, and the entire station shuddered. The metal pipes groaned like tired giants. The knuckle-walker reacted instantly. It didn't run. It lurched forward on its massive knuckles, its body undulating like a jellyfish in a slow-motion tide. It reached out with one of its stone-like hands and brushed the side of my bunk. The touch was cold, and I felt a faint vibration travel from its palm into my very bones. It wasn't just looking at me. It was tasting my presence, sensing the warmth of my skin against the chill of the concrete. I woke up in the middle of the night to find it hovering over me, its bronze fur radiating a faint heat. It didn't have eyes to blink, yet I felt it perceiving me, measuring the weight of my heartbeat against the pulse of the water. I realized then that the roots weren't just growing toward me, they were weaving a net to catch me. They were anchoring the knuckle-walker to the room, and the knuckle-walker was anchoring the room to me. I reached out a trembling hand and touched the creature's flat, leathery face. It didn't flinch. It simply leaned into my palm, its bronze fur smelling of rain and ancient dust. It was a moment of profound, heavy intimacy between a human and a creature of the deep earth. The next morning, when the sun finally broke through the high, narrow windows of the station, I found the roots had completely enveloped my bunk, pinning me into a cocoon of violet fibers. The knuckle-walker was gone, retreated to the far corner of the room, its massive knuckles resting on the floor. I sat up, my limbs feeling heavy and strange, as if I had been submerged in water for hours. I looked at the creature, and for the first time, it moved its 3 nostrils in a synchronized flare. It reached out one of its stone hands and tapped the floor once. The sound echoed like a gavel in a silent courtroom. I realized the warning in the footnote wasn't just about the growth of the roots. It was about the inevitability of the meeting. The roots had finished their journey, and the knuckle-walker had claimed its seat. As I prepared to leave the station for the day, I noticed a new root had sprouted from the floor, right where the knuckle walker had been standing. It was growing toward my chair, as if it were already preparing for my return. I stepped out into the sunlight, but as I reached the door, I felt a sudden, sharp tug at my heel. I looked down to see a tiny, violet root had pierced through my boot, anchoring my foot to the concrete floor as if the room were already beginning to pull me back inside. The Silt of Self. The barometer is the first thing to fail. It hangs from a rusted iron bracket, its brass casing weeping orange tears of oxidation into the stagnant water. I am suspended in the center of the quarry, a solitary diver in a heavy suit, watching the drought transform the world. Above, the sky is a bruised violet, and below, the water is a thick, amber soup. It is a strange, silent drought. It hasn't just stolen the river, it has stolen the memories of the landscape. The weeds that line the quarry floor are strange, emerald-colored vines that no one remembers planting. They sprouted in the middle of the dry spell, blooming with heavy, velvet flowers that smell of wet copper and old linen. They are the orphans of the drought, growing where the rain forgot to fall. I kick my fins, my breath echoing in the confines of my helmet. The water feels heavy, pushing against my chest like a physical weight. I am moving toward the center, where the silt is deepest, and that is where the silence begins to change. It isn't just a lack of sound, it is a presence. At 1700 hours, the thermometer snaps. The mercury retreats into the bulb as if it were afraid of the temperature, and in that sudden vacuum of measurement, the first ripple appears. It doesn't come from me. It comes from the silt. A shape rises, undulating like a piece of silk caught in a current. It is not a fish, nor a rock. It is a twin. It is the assembly of every version of me that a mirror has ever briefly held in the history of the world. It has my face, but it is composed of 1,000 micro-expressions. It possesses the slight squint of my childhood, the furrow of my brow from last Tuesday, and the half-smile I wore when I saw a butterfly 3 years ago. Its skin isn't smooth. It is a mosaic of textures. It has the velvet texture of a dream, the roughness of a scar, and the translucent sheen of a teardrop. It doesn't move with grace. It moves with a rhythmic, stuttering pulse as if it is constantly correcting its own posture to match mine. At 1800 hours, the anemometer loses its grip and drifts toward the quarry wall. The twin is closer now. It moves with a strange, gliding gait, its body elongated. Because it is made of every reflection, it is never perfectly still. It is a shimmering blur of me, the me that was tired, the me that was laughing, the me that was angry. Its hair is a riot of different lengths and shades, some strands thick and coarse, others as fine as spider silk. Its eyes are not a single color, they are a shifting kaleidoscope of every hue I have ever seen reflected in my own pupils. It doesn't swim so much as it occupies the space, drifting through the water like a memory becoming tangible. It reaches out with a hand that has 10 different thumb shapes, all of them twitching. It doesn't have a singular palm. It is a layered stack of my own hands, overlapping like the petals of a rose. It opens its mouth, and though there is no air to carry the sound, I feel the vibration of its voice against my ribs. "Why did you look away?" it asks. The voice is my own, but it carries the resonance of 100 different moods. It is the sound of a choir of me, singing in unison. I realize now that the drought didn't just spare the plants, it compressed the time. It pulled every moment I have ever lived into this single, flooded basin. At 1900 hours, the hygrometer falls, its needles spinning wildly. The twin is inches from my mask. I can see the individual facets of its skin. It has a mole on its left cheek that I didn't know I had until this moment, a mole from a reflection in a puddle 5 years ago. It has the slight protrusion of a tooth I broke as a child. It is a masterpiece of my own history. It reaches out and touches my helmet with a finger that is both sharp and soft. It isn't just a twin, it is the sum total of my existence, distilled into a physical form. I feel a sudden, crushing weight in my chest. The twin leans in, its face pressing against the glass of my visor. I can see the thousands of tiny variations of my own, features merging into one perfect, haunting symmetry. It doesn't move to strike me. It doesn't move to flee. It simply exists, a physical manifestation of every time I have ever caught a glimpse of myself. The water around us begins to thicken, turning into a gelatinous jelly of silt and dissolved history. I realize that it isn't just watching me, it is waiting for me to finally stop moving so it can take my place. I hold my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. The twin closes its eyes, and for a second, the quarry is perfectly still. Then it opens its mouth wide, revealing a row of teeth that are perfectly aligned, yet slightly too many for a human jaw. It speaks one final time, the sound vibrating through the water and into my very bones. "I am finally finished," it whispers. I realize then that it isn't just a reflection of who I was, but a blueprint of who I am becoming. I reach out to touch its face, and as our skin meets, I feel the cold, wet sensation of 1,000 memories pressing back against my own. I am the diver, and it is the sum of me, but as the silt settles, the distinction between the observer and the observed begins to dissolve. The twin leans closer, its face a map of my life, and I realize that it isn't just my shadow in the water. It is the version of me that stayed behind when I looked away. I see it now in the way its skin ripples. It is not just mimicking me, it is perfecting me, refining every flaw I ever possessed until it becomes the ultimate version of my soul. The water turns a deep, final black. The twin opens its eyes, and I see my own face staring back, but with a secret it has been keeping. It isn't just a mirror, it is a thief. I feel it pull me closer, the silt wrapping around our limbs like a shroud. The light from my torch begins to fade, swallowed by the amber soup. I am no longer alone in the quarry. I am shared with the ghost of every moment I have ever lived. As the last bubble of air escapes my lips, the twin smiles, a smile that is slightly wider, slightly sharper, and entirely more certain than my own. I realize that it isn't just standing next to me, it is slowly merging into my very skin. I look at its hand, resting against my chest, and notice that it has started to grow a second heart, beating in perfect, terrifying synchronization with mine. The drought has ended, the water has settled, and I am no longer the only thing in the quarry that has a name. The twin reaches out and takes my hand, its grip firm and familiar. I can feel the moisture of its skin, the slight grain of its texture, and the weight of every me that ever was. It doesn't let go. It pulls me into the silt, and for the first time, I feel the crushing reality of being doubled. The water is still, the plants are still, and the twin is finally, perfectly complete. But as I look at its face one last time before the silt covers us both, I notice that it is beginning to blink in a different rhythm than mine. It isn't just my reflection anymore, it is beginning to think for itself. The handover of the ridge. To whoever takes my shift, do not let the silence of the snow fool you. It is a heavy, expectant silence, not a void. When I took over this outpost 3 days ago, the storm was a wall of white marble, sealing us into the ridge. We dug the snow cave deep, carving out a sanctuary of jagged ice and soft powder. For the first 48 hours, it was perfect. I sat by the small lantern, watching the frost creep across the ceiling like crystalline veins. It felt safe, but on the third night, the wind changed. It stopped howling and started breathing. It began with a hum, a low vibration that rattled the teeth in my skull. Then, it found my name. I was standing just outside the mouth of the cave, adjusting my scarf, when the gale sighed. It didn't just blow, it articulated. "Elias," it whispered. It wasn't a human voice exactly. It sounded like 1,000 wet sheets of silk rubbing together, stretched thin over a hollow space. I froze. There were no other workers outside. I stepped back into the cave, my heart hammering against my ribs. I told myself it was the acoustics of the ridge, the way the ice walls funneled the air. But the wind was persistent. It waited for me to step out again. Every time I moved into the open, the gale would catch my breath and return it to me as a syllable. "Elias," it murmured again, a bit closer this time. I realized then that the wind wasn't just moving air, it was searching for me. By the second night of the storm, the whispers became more complex. It started to describe things. "Elias, the heavy stone," it groaned. "Elias, the cold light." It was mimicking the world around me, but it only spoke when I was exposed. The moment I ducked into the safety of the cave, The wind fell into a respectful, muffled hush. It was as if the entity was shy, or perhaps it was stalking me. It only wanted to speak when it knew I was listening. On the final night, the storm reached its peak. I was exhausted, my limbs heavy with the ache of constant digging. I decided to venture out one last time to check the perimeter. The air was thick with powder, making every movement a struggle. I took 3 steps into the white expanse and stopped. The wind didn't just say my name this time. It spoke in a sentence. "Elias, you're heavy," it sighed. I felt a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Then I heard the sound of a drip. Asterisk plip. Plip, asterisk, it was a heavy, rhythmic sound, like water falling from a high ceiling. But there was no rain. There was no melting ice nearby. I turned my head, squinting through the flurry. I saw it then. It was standing 20 paces away, hunkered in the drift. It wasn't a ghost or a spirit of the air. It was a creature of texture. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, its body covered in a layer of thick, sodden fabric that looked like it had been pulled from a deep, stagnant pond. The clothes were heavy and wrinkled, clinging to a frame that moved with a liquid grace. Most unsettling were the drips. The creature was constantly weeping moisture. Water fell from its hem, from its shoulders, and from the protrusions on its head, hitting the dry snow with a wet thud. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, it had a wide, horizontal slit where a mouth should be, and a pair of bulging, amber-colored spheres for eyes that looked like trapped honey. It didn't move toward me. It simply stood there, dripping, its wet garments making a soft squelch with every slight shift of its weight. It opened its slit mouth. "Elias," it croaked, the voice now vibrating in the very center of my chest. "I have been waiting for you to stand still." I didn't move. I didn't dare. The creature took a single step forward, and the wet fabric of its tunic pulled taut, shedding a sudden spray of water that landed on my cheek. It wasn't cold water. It felt thick and slightly oily, like the residue of a long-forgotten lake. It reached out a hand, not a hand with 5 fingers, but a wide, flat paddle of skin covered in tiny, shimmering scales. It touched my shoulder, and the moisture from its palm seeped into my coat. In that moment, the wind stopped entirely. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of one last drop falling from the creature's chin. It leaned in close, its amber eyes reflecting my own terrified face. "Elias," it whispered, its voice no longer a wind, but a wet, bubbling rasp. "You are finally wet." I realized then that it wasn't the wind that had been speaking my name all along. It was the creature, using the wind as its throat, calling out to the only thing in the world that could hear it. I am leaving this cave now, but I can still feel the wetness on my shoulder, and I know that somewhere in the ridge it is still dripping, waiting for the next name to call. It is no longer just the wind that speaks. It is the creature, and it knows I am no longer alone in its world. I can hear it now, even as I sit here in the safety of the hut. It is standing just outside the door, and the wet sound of its breathing is starting to seep through the wood. It isn't waiting for the wind to speak anymore. It is waiting for me to open the door and let it in. The best part is that I can hear it licking its scales in the dark, tasting the salt of my fear. I can hear it now, and it is getting closer, one drip at a time. When you take over my shift, remember, do not let it see you blink, for it finds the twitch of an eyelid to be a delicious invitation to move. I am leaving my boots by the door, but I won't be wearing them. The creature prefers it when my feet are bare, so it can feel the moisture of the ground more clearly as I walk toward it. I am not afraid of the storm anymore. I am only afraid of the sound of the wet fabric dragging against the ice. I can hear it now right behind me. It hasn't moved in an hour, but I can feel its damp presence pressing against the back of my neck. I know it is there, watching me with its honey-colored eyes. It is waiting for me to turn around and finally meet its dripping face. I can hear the wet fabric shift. I can hear the waterfall. I can hear the wind hold its breath. I can hear the creature breathe. And I can hear it now as I sit here in the silence, waiting for the door to creak open. I can hear it now, and it is smiling with its slit mouth, dripping a single, heavy bead of water onto the floor. It is ready for you to take my place, but remember, once it knows your name, it never stops calling it. I am going now, but the creature will stay. It will wait in the ridge, draped in its sodden clothes, dripping in the white silence. It is waiting for you to step outside. I can hear it now, and it is very, very hungry for a new name to carry. The wind is just its way of whispering, but the creature is the one who truly speaks. I can hear it now, and it is calling your name too. It is calling you right now. It is waiting for you to step out into the snow and feel the first drop land on your skin. I can hear it now, and it is almost here. It is almost here, and it is dripping. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories, and make sure to like.